I guess this is kind of an addendum to two separate things. So there was a recording that I made, which I think was about 3 hours, and about the last hour of that 3 hour recording is probably me just talking about the cultural crisis as I see it in terms of how it developed somewhat philosophically from the reinvention of sort of fascist philosophy and fascist ideology under the auspices of feminism's systemic oppression. That kind of that intersectional sort of uh, problematic false reduction of leveraging generalizations and things like that, um, and sort of in a cherry picked way leveraging them as sort of individual to be deployed by individuals kind of opportunistically and somewhat creatively as well, in a way that you can just kind of create uh, a useful hypothesis on the spot that helps kind of validate one's own convenient sense of expectation or self entitlement, so that one can have a kind of a very insulated and protected source of ideological self esteem, which is um, entrenched in a kind of in a formulaic narrative, and then you can just get enough agreement that that formula has a kind of cultural hegemony, and then you've kind of got like a runaway sort of doom spiral and sort of cynical scapegoating, which becomes kind of ingrained, um, and everyone ends up depending on that same instrument. It becomes a kind of a one size fits all instrument. But anyway, and it sort of produces its own kind of cult factionalism around it, at least clearly. It's and so it's interesting because in history, people that have had to burden, let's say, the kind of the prejudicial sort of bigotry that this kind of cultural hegemony utilizes, people who are on the receiving end usually uh, develop insight into how poisonous and toxic it is. That they actually their eyes are opened, as it were. Um, but then, as soon as sort of that cultural hegemony is swept away, a new one takes its place, because I take this to be a psychological property, that there are just many people in society that require stereotyped thinking leveraged in kind of specious ways in order to help simplify their life so that they can navigate via a narrative, and therefore they can always kind of have an external locus of control. They never have to be responsible for their own destinations. Um, they can kind of leverage a unilateral, insulated set of expectations which they can kind of project onto reality at will, because they can import and leverage statistics and generalizations to confirm their special pleading, essentially, as that they should be representative of a special dispensation on behalf of the unjust narrative, which designates them as essentially a part of, so they can always just use the cover of their identity within the narrative to supplement for any personal lack of curating their own uh, uh, path, and being responsible for either not cultivating the right kind of trust in their own abilities or capabilities, or estimating their own deficiencies properly enough, so that they develop and are successful, that they can just exteriorize all those pragmatic concerns into a kind of a claim, a vague and nebulous sort of claim, a hypothetical. They can transmutate it into a hypothetical complaint, and then there's nothing stopping you from just always depending on that same hypothetical complaint. Okay, anyway, and I do think that there are broader things at work as to why this kind of cultural edifice keeps on manifesting and is renewed from the female section of the population. And obviously, it's not all women, but um, I think it makes a lot of sense why this conventional way of leveraging stereotypes is something that is rediscovered by many women in each generation. If the culture has a blind spot, and that's merely because men and women have different sexual strategies in terms of how they relate to one another within the sexual marketplace, and they also have different opportunistic sexual strategies, and this creates sort of uh, uh, a natural sort of tendency uh, for women to kind of keep sort of the embers of fascism and sort of the fascist formula of sort of leveraging culture in a kind of toxic and poisonous way, um, and using this kind of external locus of control to scapegoat and to abrogate any kind of lack of responsibility, which is becomes more conspicuous in an age in which there is actually equality before the law, where the only inequality that persists is largely the persistence of, in very small part, discrimination, but in very large part the fact that men and women have different inclinations, they have different preferences, they make different choices, they have different profiles of interest. And although the median woman is probably statistically more intelligent than the median man, um, it cannot be denied that essentially, when you're just looking at the very, very top percentiles of very high IQ, uh, there's a huge disparity, there's a huge gap between men and women, and that would simply probably be for evolutionary reasons, that there is much more fierce male competition. Men are, let's say, genetically dispensable and are genetically disposed of at a much higher rate within our gene pool. So basically, there's more pressure on the male role, and this is, I mean, also I guess why, generally speaking, the pair bond that occurs within our species is generally, well, there are multiple reasons for this, but it's generally an older man and or a younger woman, and I mean the reason for that is twofold, which is that women have to select their partners based on the provision of security and comfort, because pregnancy and having a young infant um, requires a kind of stability, and uh, and so women then would obviously have proclivities toward um, testing for stability um, and support within the dynamic of a relationship and within the broader context of society or a community. So they either select their partners based on a kind of um, social status or a kind of personal value of being able to provide comfort and stability, or providing well. And especially in the modern era, but probably generally speaking, um, you can't tell if a man will be a stable, or generally speaking, men that are able to provide are going to tend towards being older men that have had the time to become more established. And then obviously, evolutionarily, the premium childbearing years uh, are going to be targeted by men, uh, in some kind of biological inclination that, because I mean, obviously the age of a woman and her ability to have optimum outcomes in terms of the health of child and mother, um, in terms of pregnancy, is much more important. Like, men obviously also at a certain rate lose their fertility, but female fertility is a much more um, vulnerable sort of thing. I mean, this has also been the reason why, um, even traditionally speaking, women um, uh, were kept out of the military, because it was regarded that the kind of stress and the kind of potential deprivation and other sort of pressures that are created in those environments. Women could very easily lose their ability to reproduce. If you have a severe enough, I mean, men can lose their fertility and can regain it if it's, but women are much more fragile in terms of their reproductive ability. Uh, and generally speaking, it's also a more precious pro-social sort of commodity that, most women have offspring. Most women pass on their genes within the line of humans. In terms of how our species usually operates, is that 80% of women will have children. If you, I think it's only 40% of men that generally have children. This has actually improved. This sort of became slightly more egalitarian in the modern era, but in terms of the evolutionary record, it's sort of uh, men were much more disposable, and therefore that also makes sense then that men would have so much more radical variety, because you don't know what is perhaps needed by a tribe, by a society. You don't know what the culture is. You don't know what the situation is, and you know essentially being able to create a highly volatile uh, 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 what's the word, spectrum of oh, I can't think of it. It starts with a D, but there's a word that just basically means I can't think of the word, but like just a highly volatile discrepancy in manifesting different traits that then like that essentially, so men are more like the kind of the experimentation in the gene pool, because it's already expected that there will be a sort of a high failure rate, and so um, you might as well try to make something that's highly specialized, um, so that you might be able to create a kind of a competitive edge, um, in some kind of short term volatile environmental problem. Uh, and this somewhat has a correlation to when you look at the IQ differences between men and women, which is that women cluster around the center and men are all over the place. There are many men that have very low IQs, and very many men that also have higher IQs. It's much more dispersed. Um, the variety has a much higher dispersal. Anyway, what this averages out to is that when women are competing amongst themselves in the sexual marketplace, they are basically competing the level to which they will be supported, or the level to which that they can obtain or secure support, depending on what's on offer. And this basically involves monitoring and tracking uh, whatever the kind of cultural hierarchy is, and looking on how to associate themselves with the people who are winning. So it's sort of like that there is there's a twofold sort of consequence of this, is that men, to be successful, have to um, increase their social status or their standing within their society, so that they can bid for the interests of women, or bid against other men, um, to the interest of women, and so that they can earn the interest of women, and women just have to basically learn how to game the system, or know enough about it, um, and make a choice. Um, so that's generally been the overarching kind of mechanism in terms of mate selection within the sexual marketplace. And what this basically leads to is a kind of paradoxical but also kind of perverse way for women to play this game, which is to leverage cultural conventions to try to entrench their self-interest in terms of how they operate this game. And to the largest extent, like, women have essentially been building in security features for their own self-interest into the culture, which is at the same time kind of disorientated women into acting irresponsibly and not taking care of their own self-interest. So it's this very kind of paradoxical maladapt. I mean, I can give one example that sort of stands out in my mind, which is that within this, there's also another feature that I need to mention, which is that the setup that I originally described as well has a general tendency to kind of compel women to have standardized standards, is to kind of to have preferences as a faction, as a block. Because if you can kind of um, because that basically becomes the loudspeaker that sets up the expectations, that set up the conventions that then um, impose uh, a kind of minimum standards, which then women don't have to directly negotiate for, but which they can get away with claiming after the fact. So they can kind of leverage two positions at the same time, where they don't have to be open and direct about what they want and about how they should regulate their own relationships. They can kind of play the kind of innocent victim, and then still get everything that they didn't ask for, but which was expected, because it was a social standard, it was a social norm. And a lot of those social norms are, generally speaking, tethered to, let's say, the healthy female um, strategy of sexual selection. But the sad thing is that the hypergamous, sort of opportunistic strategy of sexual selection can very easily conceal itself within the rubric of the healthy female sexual selection. Um, and basically, the hypergamous strategy is basically when the woman takes on the role of the infant herself, where she becomes sort of her own prospective infant and demands to be catered to and pandered to as if she was essentially mother and infant. And there's usually a very unhealthy kind of codependent dynamic that is cultivated, and there's a lot of sort of dishonesty and sort of inconsistency, as in a kind of personal hypocrisy, but also it's basically designed to exploit men as a kind of renewable resource, and also as a disposable um, source of those benefits and comforts. And essentially, this, what's also sort of premised in it is that when there's a greater offer, then the hypergamous, sort of selection is just a kind of latch on to the greatest sort of source of exploitable uh, benefits and comforts. And usually, I would say hypergamy is kind of antithetical to procreation, but hypergamy can also use pregnancy and bearing children in order to secure their source of exploitation. But and it's probably also, I mean, I think hypergamy is probably not exactly, but it probably has a high correlation to sort of cluster B personality disordered um, cases. But anyway, and obviously hypergamy is then becomes concealed and possible when there are lots of cultural conventions which are sort of taken for granted. Um, so that it's possible to kind of leverage social pressure as a way to extract resources. Now, okay, moving away from that and just going back to how I would say that certain cultural conventions paradoxically have gotten women into a state of acting irresponsibly is, I mean, the clearest example that I can think of is in terms of the fact that legitimacy used to be an important feature of culture. Like, if your children were legitimate or not, legitimacy was all about um, the paternal association with the father. So legitimate children had rights under law. And illegitimate children did not have rights under law in terms of claiming support from the father. Now, although there were obviously immediate um, discomfort created by such a harsh distinction and such a strict distinction, there was a subsequent cultural responsibility that then women had to adopt. Women had to trust their partners. Uh, generally they had to secure marriage before having children, I guess. But just to kind of metaphorically broaden the concept and perhaps update it into the modern era to some degree, it meant that women actually had to cultivate um, a kind of personal trust and stability within the relationship. Women had to test the quality of relationship, and they had to uh, be able to test the character of a man, but also in having to test these things and being on the hook for testing these things, they would actually have to cultivate a genuine or an authentic bond, pair bond, that was actually stable and that actually had real integrity. They actually had to perhaps develop themselves well enough that they actually had a mature enough character that was capable of sustaining a kind of pair bond. And this was very clearly within the purview of the female role. This was part of the kind of the cultural division of labor, that women had to test for these things, because the risk of having an illegitimate child essentially would increase their burden drastically, not having someone to share the duty of child rearing with. So, what has happened in the modern era with essentially women don't have to culturally negotiate and determine um, the level of trust in a relationship, because it's basically a given that they will be able to extract support through the use of the courts. The legal system will enforce judgments of support, perhaps for them and also the child. And so the only thing that they have to worry about is that they're associating with a man that is capable of providing, that is, let's say, rich enough, so that if there is a court order issued, that that it will um, result in support. But anyway, I mean, obviously, none of this is ideal, but I still think that it does have a heavy influence on culture, in that it has de-incentivized the concern of trust, of curating trust. And so, you know, you get this very sort of sad phenomena when women start getting a bit older, and they complain that, like, how can men who are in their 30s go out with women who are much younger than them, uh, and they won't, care about women in their 30s who have master's degrees or something like that. And, essentially, these are women who have predominantly squandered their optimum childbearing years. They've squandered their youth. They haven't sort of developed individual sort of maturity. Um, they haven't developed their characters. They've just uh, sort of inebriated themselves on the male attention that they received. Uh, and because they didn't have the cultural responsibility of using that time of their lives uh, to judge between their options, as it were. And then they resent the fact that essentially the male attention wanes, because male interest is correlated to evolutionary markers. I mean, this is how sexual selection has always worked, because that it's healthy for the species. because the age of woman is much more relevant. Um, I mean, in a sense, the age of men is much less relevant, but what is more relevant is the fact that they have resources, that they have something that they can provide, which, um, because I mean, probably also slightly evolutionarily, women have a predisposition and a preference to being protected and provided for, uh, because they are probably evolutionarily focused on and geared towards the conditions that are not just healthy for them, but are healthy for a young infant. Um, but as I say, in hypergamy, these interests are kind of amalgamated into just the self-interest of the woman. Um, and I think that conflation has been exacerbated by essentially the kind of legal protectionism that has then created this blind spot within culture, um, that women's self-interests have been so readily uh, um, built into a kind of paternalistic uh, um, cultural framework that they have relegated their own participation uh, within a kind of, they've kind of become delusional about their own role and participation in the sexual marketplace. Um, which has, in some sense, created an emphasis and a magnification of the hypergamous way of relating to of women relating to men, where essentially it's all about resources and nothing about essentially cultivating trust. Trust is essentially is built into the legal framework, so they can just focus on targeting sort of their immediate sense of what they want, and they don't have a kind of a long-term picture of how things can work. Which sadly is probably something that many women become ruined because they've been sort of indoctrinated into this mode of being, and if they don't sort of achieve cultural or individual maturity, probably by the age of 25, it's probably not possible for them, because after the age of 25, or especially around the age of 28 and onwards, um, their cynical calculation about hypergamy is already starting to develop. So they're already sort of willing to compromise on a kind of hypergamous, a stable hypergamous extraction and exploitation. And so at that point, they don't have the freedom of choice to essentially sacrifice their they don't have any let's say real uh, compromise to make anymore, because their choices are less efficacious, because at that point they're choosing, um, well, I mean, at least, in sort of strict material terms, uh, they have. This is such. I guess I'm just going to say this vaguely. I'm not going to say this so tightly, but basically, they have nothing that they can forego and sacrifice in order to prove the kind of the truthfulness of their beliefs. So how do you know that this isn't a cynical calculation, and that it is an authentic trust that they are cultivating? I don't think that you can sort of. I mean, look, I mean, it's hard to just give numbers. Like I gave numbers is probably, sort of way off. It's sort of. I guess it also depends largely on a woman's energy, as it were. Like, how does she still have high enough energy levels, or is she just completely in compromise mode? Because if she's in sort of compromise mode, and she's, what they say, like, as you're approaching 30, and I mean, there are all these words, baby rabies, like, how can you trust a woman who has baby rabies, as it's called colloquially? You can't. You're dealing with someone who their priorities and their interests are now completely antithetical to having an authentic relationship. It can't be, ascertained. And also, how she's acting is indistinguishable from hypergamy as well. It's just hypergamy with slightly different priorities. She wants to be a mother. It doesn't matter who the sperm donor is, essentially, as long as he's got a wallet. So I mean, it's almost like a variant of hypergamy at that point. So I mean, like, what does that mean in terms of the relationship and trust? It's unquantifiable. So the window of having an authentic, let's say, romantic relationship, and when I say romance, I don't mean in the Western European sort of romance. I mean within the marrying for love, um, that was, let's say, more developed by the Russian mentality and the Russian cultural sensibility. Anyway, I mean, obviously there are exceptions, and I mean, usually those exceptions really have to do with energy. Uh, when I say energy, I mean that also slightly metaphorically, but I mean, obviously there are. I mean, I think generally, if you're dealing with someone who has cluster B personality disorder sort of territory, those people are also not really capable. Well, essentially, they can't even develop trust. Trust is not something that they even have. They just have a kind of narrative navigation of reality, which gives them this kind of secure unilateral dictation of their expectations that sort of are a one-way flow of commands and suggestions and manipulation, that usually have layers of social manipulation. And it's very interesting watching these women complain, sort of as they start getting a bit older, that they don't have the same level of male attention. It's interesting as, oh, this is a complete tangent, but I wonder if some of the kind of the transsexual, let's say, fad in how it's exploded. Transsexuals used to be a very tiny proportion of the population, and how that's almost been politically engineered within the culture to become suddenly so much more prevalent. That essentially people aren't capable of being homosexual. Suddenly they are some kind of, you know, that they're being a suppressed trans person, or something like that. It's how the culture has shifted that way. I wonder if it isn't something to do with these. I do think that in some sense the vast majority of transsexuals are um, male to female, and I think that is purely because of the huge cultural power as it has been sexually demarcated along biological sex. Um, that women have this unilateral power to sort of subvert the narrative in order to secure their expectations and to freely project onto people, um, sort of at will, whatever accusation is going to engineer and secure their interests. Um, anyway, um, let me not get into that. I've made that sort of that tangent before more robustly. I'm not going to focus on it now, but I guess I'm hoping that there will be a cultural swing in the other way, in which women start to lose this very dysfunctional and disorientating, sort of ideology that women are both the same and better. Douglas Murray has spoken about this quite a bit, but how it's sort of incoherent, and how much cognitive dissonance there is in this level of thinking, that women are equal to men in every way, but they are also better. It just and one thing that they're definitely not equal in is taking blame and being made responsible and accountable for things. Uh, and you can understand, according to essentially the somewhat the evolutionarily, sort of encoded general sexual strategies that are different between men and women, you can understand why that sacred cow still stands. But you know, essentially the we need to learn as a culture to disentangle, let's say, the private realm of sexual dynamics, and the culture around sexuality, which should be, should be the ground of the individual, to do as they so wish, but that we need to have a normative system of non-sexism and non-racialism as well, that where everyone um, is accorded the same degree of agency, which is, conspicuously lacking in uh, the kinds of weird complaints that are made sort of in the vogue of systemic oppression and, sort of statistical differences in experience or something like that, which always lend themselves to some kind of scapegoating of some privilege, while completely ignoring the reason why such a privilege, why the description of such a privilege, actually exists. Because describing something as being caused by a privilege is not a real explanation; it's a hypothetical explanation. Um, and it's also quite willfully blind as to, the actual underlying reality that it's causing these things, and sort of treating the underlying reality, um, in a kind of in a bad faith of sort of overt nascence and sort of it's kind of like a willful self-ignorance, which then allows you to make the same sort of dim complaining that has no hope of resolution, really. That is frankly more invested in its complaining than it is in the resolution of its complaint, which is somewhat entrapped within a kind of within its own commitment to the complaint, more so to common sense reality. Um, because it wants to basically say, well, it's subjectively not fair given my impossible premises. Given my set of premises, which I don't want them to be questioned, because if they are questioned, that means that you're not giving me my abstract, disembodied sort of presumption of equality between everything, because everything must be considered, all things being equal, so that I can describe things as being unfair while I close my eyes to what's really going on and how the world really works, when I give no real alternative as to how the world should work, but I say that I should deserve the outcome that I'm demanding. It's willful ignorance. And when you can deploy that kind of toxic willful ignorance, you can just kind of go through your life creating convenient scapegoats and boogeymen. Anyway.